Hey everybody, welcome. We are going to get started here in just a minute. We appreciate you being here. We know some folks had spring break this week, so appreciate your attention. So yep, we'll be getting started in just a second. Okay, well, we're going to get started. So welcome, this is Kyle again. As always, if you have questions or comments along the way, feel free to enter them into, feel free to submit questions or to enter them into the chat, and either Erin or I will cover that. So this is week 4, and we are now kind of talking about the tools of ecological economics, so how we integrate the stuff that we learned about on both the social and physical sciences side from the previous classes into what we are doing today, into actually tools that we can use to try to address some of these challenges in the world. So it's a quick intro activity. We talked very briefly about ecosystem services last time, and we will be talking about them a lot more this time. So Erin has shared a link in the chat to this activity, the first part of it. So if you want to go there, pick just one of these ecosystem services or ecosystem features and try to list all the sort of things that it provides. So the stuff that the service provides, particularly the stuff that we don't pay anything for, that nature provides to us for free. So try to think about what those might be. It's totally fine to do internet research to pull some of these up. And while you're doing that, we'll check those out and look at them, and then we will continue with the exercise, and we'll talk about what some of those services are in more detail. And then this is important because we'll also come back to this as an activity at the end of the class and try to fill in more detail what these ecosystem services are, what it might take to replace them, and what it costs us when you leave. So go ahead, take a few minutes, and try to fill in them. I think we've broken them up on the presentation to sort of different services per page. So just like scroll down the slide on the exercise if you don't see your favorite ecosystem service or listed or ecosystem featured first. Looks like some folks are already starting to fill them in, which is great. And don't go beyond page slide 4 on these. The slides 5, 6, and 7, we'll use those for the closing exercise. So just focus on listening here. So I see mangroves, purge, waters, salt, and other undesired minerals. Absolutely true. That's a good one. Looks like tropical rainforest is a popular one. Lots of ones here. Nutrient cycling, definitely. They make soil, yes, very, very slowly, but they do make it. Rain making, yeah, in some sense. Climate, microclimate, climate regulation, definitely. Air quality to some extent. Certainly food production. Anybody who likes coffee or chocolate, that's a good one. Raw materials, yep. Raw materials being one of the few that actually has a market value. Some of these other ones, not so much. Recreation, definitely. Cultural, good to see that one. We'll be talking later about how we try to value cultural resources. Those are particularly difficult to value quantitatively. So that's a good one. Encourages biodiversity. I think biodiversity is in and of itself a benefit in some sense. We think of biodiversity as sort of a resilience to change or stress. So the more diverse an ecosystem is, the better it is able to withstand threats to it or to changes. And there's actually different kinds of biodiversity, like Erin was talking about when we talk about planetary boundaries. You've got genetic diversity, so species that literally have different genes, and then you have functional diversity, which is sort of the ability of things to offer services in the ecosystem that other species can't offer. And even within genetic diversity, you have multiple versions of that. So these are very important examples. And let's take a look at coral reefs. Yep, recreational value. They protect coastlines during storms. Yep, ecosystem buffering, and more biodiversity habitat for fish and other species. Excellent. And last, old growth forest, carbon sequestration, definitely. Again, a habitat for animals, so different. So biodiversity, and also important to note that, of course, different species live in different kinds of environments. So having multiple different kinds of ecosystems is also important for diversity. You just had old growth forest everywhere. It's not the same diversity as having, all of these things at once. Let's see, reuse of decomposing plants and animals. Yep. So recycling, also soil formation again. Oxygen, yeah, to a small extent. Most oxygen isn't produced in old growth forests, but yeah, that's certainly true. Moderation of weather, definitely true. Flood avoidance, rainfall, soil runoff, all those things are true. And protecting non-forest ecosystems like salmon habitat, also excellent examples. So that's a good set of examples here. So feel free to keep filling them in, but we're going to continue with the slides. So that's kind of our intro. As a review, remember what we did last time. We reviewed the first week, a brief history of economics. We then, in week 2, we looked at human well-being aspects of this field. So economics as if people were not robots. And then last week we looked at sort of environmental well-being, or sort of physical sciences, and how those planetary limits and boundaries and thermodynamics put challenges and sort of limitations on what we can do. And so today, and then also next week, we're going to kind of put these together and actually go from sort of the very fundamental theory of ecological economics into, okay, what do we do with this stuff? What tools can we use? What can we actually make out of this stuff out of these ideas to improve sort of the well-being of things that live on our planet? So here's a quick question for you to see, those of you who did the reading, particularly the nature reading. So if you read the nature paper on ecosystem services, this was the Farley paper, what was the sort of headline result from that paper? What was sort of the biggest thing that they found? And feel free to look back at the paper if you didn't look at it yet for the answer. But what was the biggest thing that they sort of discovered coming out of it? Okay, time's up. So the biggest thing that came out of this paper was essentially the idea that, based on their valuation techniques, the value of services provided by the environment around the world was actually bigger than the entire global economy. So all this stuff that nature provided, at least as of the date of that piece of research, which is a little bit dated now, but not too bad, was actually larger than the entire economy. So if we go back to picture that model that we had early on, sort of the full world versus the empty world, where sort of, the world is around the economy, that's essentially what they found, but they put some dollar values on it. Not a complete valuation of nature's services, but a pretty comprehensive, and at that time, especially the most comprehensive. And that number, so it truly was bigger than the economy, even in dollar terms, let alone physical terms. So that's a big deal, that the global ecosystem services are bigger in terms of monetary value than the entire economy. And at the time, it was at least double the size, which is probably sort of a minimum, because they note in the paper that there's a bunch of stuff that they couldn't quite quantify. And so, if you include both the stuff that they could have a value, but they couldn't quite figure it out, and the stuff that doesn't have a value, it's huge. So, and then the other big piece of this paper was that, these things are not valued in the market. The market treats them as if they're zero, but they're really not. They're actually quite valuable just in dollar terms, let alone in other types of value. So that's pretty significant. That suggests that if we lost those things, it would take more than the cost of our entire economy essentially to replace them. And that would be that. And so that's kind of like, that's almost a seminal example of ecological economics and how to do it. It was incredible. And ecosystem services valuation in general is kind of a perfect example of what sort of the founders of ecological economics sort of thought about in terms of what this field should look like, that it's truly a fusion of economics and ecology kind of coming together, social and sort of natural and physical sciences all becoming used as, the tools of those fields being used all at once to understand a problem that stretches beyond the boundaries of any one of those fields. So really, on the one hand, you've got to understand ecosystems. You have to understand how much we have of them, how quickly they change, how are we using it, how fragile or how resilient are they, and then, of course, how much sort of uncertainty is there in our understanding of them. And you also have to understand the economics, right? You have to understand what these things might cost in the market, what alternatives there are in the market, how much people value them, or what dollar value they might assign to them. And so this is just a great example of what an ecological economics practitioner does that sort of no other field can quite do. And there's a lot of valuation techniques on the economic side. These are tools that are used not just by ecological economics practitioners, but also by other economic fields. And we've kind of tried to give you a sense of what these techniques are. So there's sort of three kind of categories that we typically recognize for dollar value valuation. So there's market prices, which is sort of the most straightforward of these. And so this is like the amount of, so if you think about it in terms of ecosystems, you've got productivity, which is basically actual money that comes out of these ecosystems. So that can be things like raw materials. So it's just, this is what they actually produce, and this is how much of the stuff that they produce can just be bought for in the market. Then you've got hedonic pricing, which is basically a way of looking at how the price of something existing changes the value of things and things around it. So you've got cases where, the value, where having a park across the street from your house increases the value of your house by a certain amount. People like living next to parks more than they do like old factories. So we can actually measure a dollar value change in, say, the market for houses if we look at those that are located near parks versus something else, all else being equal. Then you've got travel costs, which is like, this is the most easily applied to like national parks or like beaches. So the people value them in the sense that they spend money to go see them and go interact with them. So for you to go whitewater rafting in a pristine, river, you have to pay to drive there. You spend money along the way. You stay in a hotel. You buy food along the way. You pay for gas. Maybe you pay an entrance fee. You buy equipment. These are actual market transactions related to you go in whitewater rafting that you would not have spent if the river wasn't there or wasn't as good of a quality or didn't have the features that you were looking for. So we can actually measure those more straightforwardly, which is nice. Then we have a little bit trickier, which is imputed willingness to pay. So this is basically like, it's not a market transaction, but we can compare it to real market transactions. And so we can get a sense of what it would cost because we can look at other things that actually do have a market value. So there's damage costs avoided, and that's like the amount that you would pay if something provides a service that provides protection. This is like the amount that you would pay if that thing weren't there. So if trees protect, forests protect you from a landslide, how much would it have cost? How much would you have paid if that landslide had happened and you had to clean it up, or it wrecked your house, or ruined your backyard, or whatever? So you've avoided paying those costs because this ecosystem service was there and saved your butt. And so that's price that we can actually value because, this does happen to people sometimes and we know what it costs. Then there's replacement costs, is similar. So what would it cost to basically restore or repair this thing if we lost it? So, how much would it actually cost us to replace this service if it was gone? And so this sort of restoration replacement cost is another thing where we can actually provide some value. And then there's substitution cost, which is related. Substitution cost is, okay, if we don't have this service anymore, if we don't have, say, water filtration by a wetland and we have to put in a water filtration plant, how much would that cost? And so, the cost of replacing it with something or substituting it with something else that does the same service, what is that worth? And then we get into the most challenging but also field, but also the one that sort of can reach the furthest and get a deeper sense of value from people. And this is express willingness to pay. And basically, this is like asking people how much they would pay for something. So you're actually just getting them to provide the value of things instead of figuring out what the market looks like for something where there isn't a market. This one is nice because it can get into some of the values that we talked about last time that are difficult to put a dollar price on. So when you ask people how much they would pay for something, all of their values are getting kind of squished together into one statement of worth. And so the values of things like the existence value that we talked about last time, or the bequest value, those are kind of in there, embedded in their statement, or at least they often are. And we either can use as a positive to understand how much those values add up to the total, or we can use techniques to kind of tease out different aspects of those values by asking particular questions. And contingent valuation and contingent choice are sort of the two main techniques that we use for these. These are basically going and asking people to give you values for things. So actually asking them what it would be worth for some ecosystem service. Either depending on the technique that you use, asking them what you would pay, what you'd be willing to pay to preserve something, or what you would want as compensation if somebody took away that thing. So like what are you willing to pay to preserve, that clean creek that runs behind your house, or that, swimming pool or a lake that you swim in? How much would you be willing to pay for that? Or what would we have to pay you if we were going to go and dirty it up or pollute it or drain it? What's that worth to you? And there's different ways of asking these things. This is not an advanced course, so we won't go through all of the surveying techniques that ecological economics practitioners and others use to actually find these values and sort of tease out the different kinds of values and control for bias and those sorts of things. But if you're interested, we have resources for learning more. But in a basic sense, these are the kinds of techniques that we use to understand what these values are. And what's interesting is that this is also a great example. Ecosystem service valuation is a great example of what happens when ecological economics ideas and tools become popular and sort of go mainstream. And usually what happens is that people start calling them environmental economics, or in some cases, not to trash on the environmental economists, but sometimes the environmental economics folks then start saying, well, these are our techniques. This is now environmental economics. So the idea of evaluating ecosystem services 30 years ago was sort of not a very popular idea that you could put value on these things, or that these services had a dollar value, was seen as kind of crazy. And then as ecological economics folks started doing it, then everybody said, oh, well, this is just economics, this is environmental economics. So it's interesting how the sort of different disciplines sort of start laying claim to particular techniques or approaches as they become more popular. More disciplines start taking them up. So that's an interesting trend that we will probably continue to see, especially as we talk next week on indicators and alternatives to GDP. This is another area where this is starting to become more popular, and it was an area that ecological economics and some other fields sort of pioneered, and now that it's being recognized as important, other disciplines are saying, oh yeah, well, this is normal now, we do this too. Which is a good sign. It's a good sign that ecological economics is kind of taking off. But it's also interesting to see how people respond to this in sort of an academic world. So there's a couple of interesting books that you might want to read about that talk about ecosystem services in sort of a real-life context, and examples of societies where they actually sort of killed off a bunch of their ecosystem services. Spoiler of that is that it didn't end well. It was not good for those societies when they got rid of their ecosystem services, when they killed them. Two very popular ones are Collapse, which is the more popular of the two. That's by Jared Diamond. It's a bit old now, but still quite relevant. So I recommend reading that one. It's a bit longer. And then there's Paradise for Sale, A Parable of Nature, which is actually written by ecological economics practitioners that actually Erin and I have both worked with. So that's one that is nicer because it's short. It's written from the ecological economics perspective, and it's a little bit more digestible. And it's only one story, whereas Collapse is a story about lots of different societies. And then more recently in the literature, you've seen things around resource conflicts. That's kind of a newer topic that's coming up. I don't have specific books to recommend, but things like climate change-induced resource wars and those sorts of things. Again, the spoiler is like it doesn't end well. People start fighting. There's war. It's bad. So using it for ecosystem services is not a good idea. But that's kind of what these books are. And when we get to the end of the course, we will have a much longer list of reading materials that you can use to extend your studies and learn more about these things. These are nice because they're more sort of written for the general public. And so they don't say ecosystem services in some cases, but that's really what they're talking about. Now we're going to get into another sort of interesting topic in this field, which is how do you deal with those things that are harder to value in a quantitative sense, and yet we know have value. So Erin is going to continue with this part.
All right, just let me show my screen and get my webcam running here. Okay, so as Kyle mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about some of the quantitative methodologies that we use for valuing ecosystem services, and more in general for just determining how people use their natural resources and may be impacted by things like climate change. And so I've talked about this before in a couple different sessions. One of the main characteristics of the field of ecological economics is that it's a multidisciplinary field, and they use methodologies from other fields, including sociology, anthropology, and political science. So traditional economists rely mainly on quantitative data, so numbers, math, models, whereas ecological economists are more open to using qualitative data as well. And I'm going to tell you how we go about gathering that data and how that data can be used. So as I mentioned, this can be a tool for ecosystem services valuation. It's a way of actually talking to people and finding out how they actually use their natural resources and what things they might value, like some of those harder to define areas like cultural benefit, spiritual benefit, and aesthetic values. And they can also be used as a way to help create community development plans, community conservation plans, even community adaptation plans in areas where people are starting to have to shift their behavior as a result of a changing climate. So this is a nice little quote I like to use when I talk about the difference between quantitative and qualitative methodologies. So an engineer and a sociologist were tasked with finding the height of a church steeple. The engineer measured the angle to the top of the steeple and calculated the height using trigonometry. Then, to check the estimate, the engineer climbed up to the top of the steeple and lowered a string until it touched the ground, climbed back down and measured the length of the string. The engineer compared the measurement to the estimate, calculated the standard error, and drafted a report documenting the methods and results. The sociologist bought the sexton a beer in the local pub, and he told her how high the church steeple was. So it's essentially giving you two different ways that you can get to the same answer. And in the field of engineering and science, we're more likely to use the more calculating mathematical way, which is great, which is also important. But it's also important to know that you can sometimes get a lot of information simply by talking to people and asking the right questions. And actually, a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods work very well together because they each have their strengths and weaknesses. So the strengths of using a quantitative methodology is that it's good for very focused questions. It's very well respected in the sciences. It's considered to be real data. Scientists and engineers like to have real numbers behind something, and the larger the better. We're really into this big data concept right now. With qualitative data, you can look at one specific part of a complex issue, and you can break that issue down into simpler parts. And when you have a big data set, it's really nice to make, it's really easy to make nice visuals, graphs, charts, whatever it is that can give a clear visual representation of your findings. So some of the strengths of qualitative research and qualitative methodologies is that it can give you a broader overview of the situation instead of letting you just look at one small concept. It can allow you to get a more in-depth understanding of a complex issue, so you're not just looking at one little part of an issue, you're looking at the issue as a whole. And it doesn't oversimplify data for the ease of analysis. So sometimes when you need to use quantitative data, you need to simplify things, you need to make a lot of assumptions, you need to leave some things out, or else your data set could get, and your analysis could get hugely complicated. So qualitative data says it's okay for your data to be complicated, you can still get something out of this data. So a good example of this from my own research. So I look at how climate change impacts farmers in the Peruvian Andes and the Mexican Yucatan, and I use both quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitative data, I use agricultural census data and see how many hectares of different crops they're planting from year to year. But on the qualitative side, I also spend a lot of time doing interviews, field visits, talking to families that are actually farming in these communities and ask them what's going on, what's changed historically, what are they doing differently now that their ancestors didn't do. So I'm able to not only look at the data and see what's changing, but also to get an idea of why it's changing. And so I was talking to someone once about this at a climate change conference, and he had a similar research topic. He also looked at how climate change impacted what crops people were planting in, I think it was Vietnam, and I can't remember the two major crops. I want to say it was rice and soybeans. I could be wrong. But he was able to look at some big data and say in years where they have more precipitation, people plant more rice and less soybeans. And so I started asking him, like, oh, is it just that farmers on their own individual plot are planting less of one or more than another, or are they completely not planting one in those years? And he said, I don't actually know. I've never been there. I don't really know why people are doing it. I just have this data that tells me that this is what's happening. And he was a traditional economist, so that's more of a traditional economics approach, which is important. It's important to see what people are planting in different years and how rainfall impacts that. But it's also really important to know why they're doing it. Because if you don't know why, it's hard to, if you're trying to adapt to climate change, it's hard to come up with interventions or help people figure out how to adapt to those challenges, figure out ways that they can maybe work with the challenge of lower rainfall if you don't really know why they're making the decisions that they make. So one specific type of qualitative research is called participatory research. It's also sometimes called participatory rural appraisal or participatory rapid appraisal. I like to use participatory research because it's a more general term. So it involves doing collaborative research with the aim of supporting local people in analyzing their situation and coming up with plans for action. So this originated from the field of development, and it began in the 1970s as sort of a grassroots approach, a way to get local people involved in the research that they were doing. So it's kind of the opposite of extractive research, what people had done historically, where researchers would either gather data or go into a community and take data, make their own recommendations according to their own analysis without really talking to the people in the community and getting a good sense from the people in the community what was going on, and also without involving people in the community involving them in the decision making and recommendation making with their analysis. So today, this type of research technique is used by organizations like Oxfam, the World Bank, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and a lot of other smaller NGOs as well. So I'm going to talk about some of the main different types of techniques that are involved in participatory research. So one of those is called participant observation, and that's a method for studying people as they go about their daily routines and activities. It's not structured, so it's where the research will accompany people to observe what they're doing and what they say, and participate in varying degrees to the activities that they're studying. So in my case, it was living with a family in the Peruvian highlands and going with them into the agricultural fields to see what it was they were doing on a daily basis, and how it was that they were planting their crops and selling their crops in the market. Participatory mapping is another technique, and this is a method used to explore a local understanding of natural resources and the environment by asking community members to make their own map of the community that shows resources that are important to them. So buildings, landmarks, water sources, fuel sources. And so you can see how going in and looking at a community, you could get a sense of where things were, but you wouldn't necessarily get the same sense as what's most important to people there. So you might completely miss out on things that they would include on their map, and you might over or undervalue different resources than someone that actually lives in the community and uses those resources would. And you can kind of see a picture here of someone doing it. Typically they start with an outline map of a region, and they give people just like markers, stickers, sticky notes, whatever it is, and ask them to go in and fill in the map. And this also tends to be an interesting activity for communities when it's done with a large group. It gets a lot of good discussion going on, and of course, even people within the community will have different views on what resources are important and where the key areas are. So two types of interviewing or getting data out of people by talking to them. One is called semi-structured interviews. So unlike a survey where you have a small set of questions and you're asking everybody the same exact questions and only have a set number of answers they can provide. For these types of interviews, you have sort of an interview guide to guide the questions or the topics that you're going to talk about, but you have some flexibility. So you use open-ended questions, and then you can follow up with those questions based on how people responded. So instead of asking everybody the same set of 5 questions, you might have a few different topics you want to hit on. And maybe if you start with the same initial question, but then you would ask someone a different question if they gave you an answer that brought up a new topic that was unfamiliar to you, or that showed how something that was really important to them that you might not have initially thought to ask about. So sort of like a semi-structured interview, but with a group, is a focus group discussion. You might have heard of the term focus group discussions. A lot of like medical device companies and product development companies use focus group discussions to have people provide feedback to their product. But it can also be done for evaluating natural resource use as well. So this is when you set up a group, usually around 6 to 8 is a good number. Too few people and you don't have enough different opinions and discussions. Too many people and it can become too difficult to manage the group. And it's sort of, you have a discussion facilitated by the researcher, designed to bring out people's different views and get them really thinking about these things. And the important thing with having multiple people in the room at once, as opposed to just doing a one-on-one interview, is when you have multiple people kind of have to state the reasoning behind the views they express, or else someone else might challenge them, causing them to go into a more in-depth answer that actually backs up what they're saying. So another one that I use in my research is called seasonal calendar construction. And this is a way of looking at local knowledge of seasonal differences in weather, the different agricultural activities and other activities that are undertaken each month throughout the year. And to do this, you essentially create a blank table with columns for the months and rows for typical weather in that month, agricultural activities people undertake in that month, economic activities people undertake in that month. So is it a month that people are selling potatoes or not? Is it a month that people are spending more time migrating to look for outside labor? And you can also include holidays and religious events, etc., and all those types of different things in there. And so when I do this, I also do a row for, typical weather and then climate weather changes that people have observed recently in their climate. And it's a really nice way to get an overall look at a whole year, because if you're doing research, you're typically only asking people, you're not necessarily spending an entire year in the area you're investigating. So you might miss out on something by, people tend to think about what's going on currently, what challenges they see currently. So they're more likely to talk about what type of climate changes they're seeing in this month and the past few months, and what type of agricultural activities they've been participating in this month. So this is a way of getting an entire look at the full year, the full agricultural cycle, if it's agriculture you're looking at. But also works for other resources as well. There's lots of fluctuations in, rainy seasons, when people have monsoons, availability of, fish species throughout various times of year. So it works for a lot of different resources, not just for agriculture. So transect walks are another method where the researcher will walk with the community leader. It doesn't necessarily have to be a community leader, but typically a community leader or head of a community will know more about a lot of different families in the community, a lot of the different agricultural features and natural resources in the community. And so you kind of walk around, you take this guided walk throughout a village or a town, and have someone point out to you different physical features and different crops and what agricultural practices are maybe used in these areas, what local vegetation there is there, and how people manage their natural resources in those different areas. And this goes well with participatory mapping, because if you have ahead of time people from the community make you a nice map, you can kind of walk through and do what's called ground truthing. See if what you're seeing on your walk actually matches the map that someone has drawn out for you. And this is also good, transect walks or ground truthing is also good if you have quantitative data on what types of crops, how many hectares of each crop someone is planting in a certain place. You can actually walk through and see if that's true and see if you're actually, seeing the crops that you expect to be seeing. All right, go. Before we jump to the activity, so these, in my research I work in mostly developing areas, but these techniques aren't limited only to those areas. These are techniques that, would work in your own local community as well, in natural resource areas surrounding your local community. Although they were initially started for developing countries, they're now used all over the world, really. Okay, so with that, we want to jump back in to that activity. And so you may have noticed while you were doing the first few slides on there that we actually had 3 slides below that we left blank. So what we want to do is pick one of those systems we were looking at in the initial activity: a coral reef, an old growth forest, what were the others? A mangrove and a rainforest. And we want to try and go into a little bit more in depth of what we were doing. So what are the services that this system provides, which is what we already started to list. So what would be the alternatives to provide these services if the ecosystem would be destroyed? So would you have to build, like Kyle suggested, a water filtration plant if you got rid of a wetland? So this can be either an engineering solution or another solution. So how would you begin to value these services? So we want you to think about the topics that we've been talking about today, the qualitative research methodologies, and those different types of valuation that Kyle talked about. So, how would you, if you were a researcher tasked with figuring out how much value these, a coral reef provides, how would you actually begin to do that? And then we want to talk about, so which of these services are ones that would actually be really difficult to quantify in monetary terms? And maybe if you couldn't quantify them in monetary terms, how would you try to quantify them? So let's see, I'll paste this link here again in the chat box for those that joined a little later. And we want to start down on slides 5, 6, and 7. Mangrove, rainforest, Coral reef, we lost one.
Yeah, I think we only ever made 3 slides, so I'll add a fourth slide for our old growth studies.
I'm going to stop sharing my camera. And people are also welcome to talk if they have one that they want to talk about, pose a question about, ask our opinion about, or the opinion of other people in the class. So just use the raise your hand feature if you want us to take you off mute. And I think you guys someone's off mute and has background noise, so just make sure you remute yourself if you're someone with a lot of background noise.
If you haven't been invited, I'm sorry. My friend, like you, is just something we've done for as long as I can remember. If you feel really offended, come talk to me. And then it's spring break. So we're good for a little Does anybody else have questions, or you're just working?
Unmuted.
Okay, so let's see what people are. I'll give you a few more minutes to start going through and thinking about this before we start talking through it. I guess I'll pick one and put some stuff into. All right, so we'll start with the first one on here, the mangrove service. So someone said that it provides free food. So an alternative to that, if you didn't have the mangrove there, was you would have to try to save the fish species living in the area, or maybe you would have to use fish farming instead, since people wouldn't be able to just go out and collect fish there. So how to value it? So it would be the cost of actually preserving the animals. So the cost of, creating some sort of program that would help save or reintroduce an animal species. Or it could be, if fish farming was your alternative, the cost of setting up a fish farm, bringing in all the feed and the nutrients, and developing the nets and whatever other infrastructure goes into that. So non-monetary values are something like diversity. So you're losing diversity. And again, this is what we were talking about. So, animals and diversity, there's value just for the sake of diversity and having those animal species themselves that you can't really put a monetary value on. And life could also potentially be diminished in the affected area if, fishing in mangroves was your former way of life, and now that's no longer a possibility for you. You might find that the quality of your life is diminished if you have to change to being a fish farmer or to looking elsewhere for your food source. So another one on the same topic is that a mangrove can protect the land from storm surges, from flooding. So an alternative, if we got rid of mangroves, would be you could build some sort of concrete retaining wall or some sort of barrier to protect the land from storms. This one would be relatively easy to value because you could just value it by, saying the cost, what would it actually cost to build this sort of retaining wall. Non-monetary values is that a concrete barrier might be uglier to look at than a mangrove. It might diminish your views. Might diminish the aesthetic value of the place where you live. Let's see what other ones we have here. So similar to what we just talked about with mangroves and the coral reef ecosystem, I see someone also put that coral reefs provide storm buffering. An alternative would be that you could build a sea break. And how to value, again, would be the substitution cost. So what would it actually cost to build a seawall? Or you could also use replacement costs. So another alternative instead of a sea break is making an artificial coral reef, which they are starting to do. So simply by calculating how much it would cost to make a coral reef to replace the one you lost, you could get a good idea of value. So non-monetary value, this is a good one, the trauma cost of people who survive a storm that's no longer buffered by the reef. So maybe having your house destroyed, your farm destroyed, your car, whatever it is that you have. Good. Let's see. Old growth forest seems to be one that we have a lot of people working on. So they also prevent floods. So you can manually construct a surface soil retention system if you wanted to go ahead and cut all these trees down. How to value it. So you could calculate the cost of labor and material you would need to construct these sort of soil banks. You could also calculate using damage avoidance costs. So if all the trees were gone and you had a flood or mudslide, what would be the cost of that damage? And non-monetary value, good one here. Again, aesthetic view. A forest looks nicer than a denuded hillside would look. Some others, this has recreational and educational value. So what would be the alternative to this one? What would you do if you didn't have a, national forest that you could go and visit? Anyone have good alternatives here?
Disney World.
Virtual forests and Disney World and museum exhibits where you pretend you're in a forest but you're not really.
Right. Or like my virtual reality headset or something, right? Like
yeah.
Some other way to experience the same thing.
Is it the same thing though?
Right, it's not. That's the thing, right? It's very difficult to replace it exactly. There's even research showing that, people get different experiences and just sort of different values out of different kinds of ecosystems. So, some people like going to the beach, other people don't. Some people like going to see a forest, other people don't. So even having a diversity of kinds of ecosystems is important for sort of people's well-being, even among people who value nature just for itself or for sort of the recreation value. Not everybody wants to go whitewater rafting, right? These are all really good examples. Trying to think of some other ones that people talked about last year. So particularly for coral reef and rainforests, because they tend to be particularly biodiverse, people mentioned the genetic value for like pharmaceutical research of all of the different species that are there. So that was a good one. And so, replacement for that would be basically extra money spent on R&D at a pharmaceutical company, which, as we know, that's very expensive research to do. It's sometimes much cheaper to just go and find something in nature. So that's one that people pointed out. Of course, as we talked about before in last class, there's these bigger values that are really hard to put dollars on, which is like just the fact that these ecosystems exist and that people know that, the rainforest is out there or coral reefs are out there, even if they never see them. So that's a value that applies to all of these and is very hard to value. And then the same idea of like that's a quest value, like not just knowing that it's out there, but knowing that, you know, future generations or your kids or something will be able to go and see these things, or they'll be able to go whitewater rafting, is something that people also value. And that one, pretty hard to put a science or engineering solution to that one, unless you can make, I guess, a totally artificial rainforest or something. So those are good ones. I'm trying to think of what else we had before. The microclimate stuff is very important. Obviously, the carbon sequestration is particularly important, and other kinds of filtration. Yeah, these are all very good examples. And if you think back, another way to think about these are to think back to the planetary boundaries that Erin talked about, and think about which ecosystems have the biggest impact on sort of controlling those boundaries and keeping things within those boundaries. You know, what all of these obviously have an impact on biodiversity and sort of genetic diversity. Some of them, the forests in particular, have an impact on the climate change and carbon cycle limitations. Things like the mangroves have an impact on the nutrient, the phosphorus, and the nitrogen export, and keeping those under control. So, you know, all of these, so different ones on here are going to basically give us a buffer against the crap that we put out there, the pollution that we put out there, and filtering it to some degree. So when we lose that, it's easier to exceed those boundaries because there's nothing out there in nature that is providing kind of a stop to it. On the other hand, some of the other planetary boundaries, we don't really have an ecosystem service at all to kind of filter them, really. So when we were talking about the one that they call, what do they call it now, like novel species or something, which I think is biodiversity, but like new chemicals that we make, that we put out into the environment. In many cases, there is no natural system to degrade or take up or, you know, sequester those new chemicals, and so they are potentially particularly dangerous because we don't have any kind of buffer. We have no system in place to address them, to do something about them. So it's kind of all on us, in some sense, to find engineering solutions to deal with them, or we haven't talked a lot about this yet, but, you know, create policies or procedures to basically prevent them from ever being released in the first place, or to test chemicals before they are released to find out whether they're harmful or not. So that's another kind of strategy on the social science side that we can employ to address some of these issues that we'll get into later.
And hopefully with these types of methodologies, you can see how as a scientist or an engineer you would use these. So if you're tasked for siting, you know, I don't know, a new parking garage or something, and you have to look at what's the area you're clearing out, or, you know, the area where you're putting this garage, hopefully this gives you a way of thinking about, so what will we actually be losing by choosing to put this garage in this particular place versus another? What are the ecosystem services there? How would we value them? Does that did the value we're going to get out of building a garage or whatever it is that we're building more than make up for what it is that we're losing?
Exactly. And think, too, about if you were in that position of the non-monetary values that are potentially being lost, and think about some of the tools that Erin gave you for qualitative evaluation. What tools can you use in that sense for helping to value these things in a non-quantitative way? One of the most common, at least in the U.S. or in many industrialized countries, for trying to get at least an early stage of non-monetary valuation and sort of qualitative is community meetings, right? Like whenever you have to have a new project that's going to be added, they have a meeting and people can come and like say good things about the project or complain about things that they think are bad. That's kind of a very weak way of allowing people to bring up values that are not easily quantifiable and introducing sort of local knowledge to the assessment of a particular project. There are more sophisticated ways of doing it, but that's one that's used quite often. and that at least starts to get at this problem of, the person who only sits in their office and looks at the data but doesn't ever have a sense of what's available in the field. So we're getting close on time. Erin, do you want to talk about our readings and other announcements for next time?
Sure. Let's see. Jump back to our slides here. All right, so for next week, our last class, that went by really fast, we're going to talk about economic development. We're going to talk about some of the alternative indicators, besides gross domestic product for determining development and well-being. And we're going to talk a little bit more about implementing the theories of ecological economics, in your life and in your work. So we have one article to read. This is an article on the genuine progress indicator, one of the alternative indicators that we'll be talking about, that's increasingly becoming a measure that people are using to look at well-being instead of GDP. Watch the TED Talk on the Happy Planet Index. This is another indicator that includes both measures of environmental and human well-being. And look over, I say look over because this is like a 90-page document, so we obviously don't expect you to look at all of it, but get a good idea of what the goals are. So this is the International Council for Science's review of targets for the Sustainable Development Goals. So look at what are those Sustainable Development Goals, and what does the International Council for Science have to say about them, because we're going to be talking about the SDGs next week as well. And so we also are going to have, the week after our class ends, we have ESW and the Network of Early Stage Scientists and Engineers are offering, or Sustainable Scientists and Engineers, are offering a webinar that's actually very similar to what we've been going over in this class. This is a free webinar. You're welcome to attend it. Talking more in depth about these alternative indicators of well-being. So we have Dr. Ida, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Kubaszewski, from the Crawford School of Public Policy at Australian National University, and she's going to be talking about these alternative indicators and how they relate to the Sustainable Development Goals. So she's going to be really getting more in depth about what some of the concepts that we'll be introducing next week. So it's Wednesday, March 24th at 4 p.m. Eastern. We'll be sending out an email so everyone can pre-register for it, and we'll use GoToWebinar just like we do for this, and it'll be about a 40-minute talk with a 20-minute question and answer session on there as well. So I think that's everything. If anyone has any questions, we'll stick around for a bit, or you're always welcome to email us. We'll throw all those readings into the week 5 folder on the website. I don't think they're up there yet, but I'll get those up right after the class. And for now, we'll just jump back to going through this activity that we're doing here about valuing these different ecosystem services, and we'll keep doing this for another few minutes.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks for joining us. If you're on break, enjoy your break. And thank you for being here, even though it's break, and we'll see you next week. Jumping back to this, the mangrove one is an interesting one because we're talking about, building like an artificial barrier. I think mangroves are one of the things where scientists and engineers are trying to figure out ways where they can actually build artificial mangroves. And I think they actually have built some that have, of course they're not as good as the real thing, but they actually can serve a lot of the features of a real mangrove.
Yeah, it's been one of the areas, and I know I think one of the challenges that they've found is trying to model all of the processes that happen within a mangrove, and sort of as water and nutrients and other chemicals are filtering through it. They were sort of surprised at how many layers of complexity that there were. That sort of like when they ran the model the first time, when the environmental engineers ran it the first time, it was like, oh, these model outputs don't look anything like what a real mangrove is doing. So they had to keep adding in sort of layers, like essentially algorithms, layers and layers of additional steps into the process, because it was so difficult to model how things were moving through the system, and how the mangroves were interacting with both sort of the saltwater and freshwater systems, and then also other sort of things that were in the area. So it's just a good example of like, these are complicated systems that are not easy to replace. Putting up a barrier, a concrete wall is not the same thing as putting up a barrier island, to protect against storm surge or something.
And it's actually great. It's great that they're going through that exercise and now seeing that and realizing, oh, it's not that easy to build an artificial one. There's a lot that this system does that we take for granted because we don't even really realize what's going on.
Right. And there's also and then there's sort of this challenge of if you're building a replacement for one service that the ecosystem provides, that's a very purpose kind of driven like single project, but there's all these other services that this thing provides that you as a project manager may not care about. Like your goal is just to protect against storm surge, right? But there's all these other things that the ecosystem provides, and so how do you incorporate all those other services into your decision making? Who else has to do it, because that becomes a challenge, or there becomes a danger that you find a really good replacement for one service, you put it in place, but then all these other services go unserved, and other people, end up suffering because of that. So it's an interesting challenge for sort of integrated decision making across different groups of people who are trying to address some of these losses.
And I guess you wouldn't want it to come out that they're like, oh, it's really easy to build our own mangrove. We don't have to worry about this problem. We'll just, as they get wrecked and cut down for whatever, we can make new ones if we need to.
Right. It's a challenge. It's a challenge sort of for society as our ability to engineer replacements for ecosystem services increases. On the one hand, that's good because we want replacements in some cases, or we want ways to augment the capability of the ecosystem. But on the other hand, if it's very narrow in our decision making, how do we decide when and if it's appropriate to put in place an ecosystem service replacement, given that there's a bunch of other services that may not be replaced?
Trying to see if anyone's typing in any of the other areas. I don't see anything. All right, we can probably go ahead and end and jump off for the week. And we'll see everyone next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.